Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest in a series of special interest talks from the CIBSE Retrofit and Heritage Committee. Today, we are focusing on PAS 2038, which is the publicly available specification on retrofitting non-domestic buildings for improved energy efficiency. I'm really pleased to be joined today by the technical author of PAS 2038 and a conservation architect that has used PAS 2038. I'll introduce both speakers fully just before they talk. And the last thing that I want to say is please put any questions that you have in the chat box, and we'll try and answer as many as possible at the end of this webinar. So without further ado, our first speaker today is Dr. Peter Rickaby, who originally qualified as an architect and has over 40 years of experience as an energy and sustainability consultant, mostly in social housing and recently focused on retrofit. He chaired the BSI Retrofit Standards Task Group for 5 years and was the technical author of the original editions of PAS 2035, which is for domestic retrofit, and PAS 2038 for non-domestic retrofit. Peter is an honorary senior research fellow at University College London, where he helps to run the UK Centre for Moisture in Buildings. And he is also a retrofit consultant for Savills, where he's working on retrofit processes for large-scale PAS 2035 compliant projects funded by the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. So over to you, Peter, when you are ready to share your screen.
Thanks, Dan. Can you see that?
I can. Thank you, Peter.
Great. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I've been asked to talk, as you heard, about PAS 2038 itself, something that I was involved in writing a couple of years ago now. The standard is about retrofitting non-domestic buildings for energy efficiency, and not specifically about heritage buildings, but it does quite actively embrace heritage buildings through involvement of a lot of the heritage groups in the steering committee that put the standard together. So I'm going to start with slightly obliquely with a diagram of a thing called the BSI Retrofit Standards Framework, which was brought into being after the Each Home Counts review in order to set up a quality assurance framework for retrofit work across the piece. And PAS 2038 sits at the right in the middle there, as you see, alongside PAS 2035, which is the domestic standard. And you could probably ignore the top line because that's all the trust mark, quality mark, code of conduct, customer charter stuff. But the bottom line identifies sets of standards to which PAS 2035 and PAS 2038 refer, and with which they mostly require compliance. So we have existing BSI standards, we have non-BSI standards from other bodies, including CIBSE, and we have a whole tranche of new BSI standards which continue to be developed and added to the framework by the BSI Retrofit Standards Task Group. And the point of showing you this is that the idea of the Retrofit Standards Framework is that whenever either PAS 2035 or PAS 2038 is complied with or required to be complied with or mandated for any kind of work, then the other standards to which it refers in the boxes at the bottom are also brought into play. So if you like, the framework is a mechanism for bringing all the relevant standards to bear on projects which are required to comply with the main ones. So let's focus on PAS 2038 now. It was sponsored by BEIS, now known as DESNES, I think, to underpin future policy. That policy hasn't really emerged yet, partly because the people we wrote PAS 2038 for have moved on, but it is now beginning to pick up some momentum again. So I think we'll see some non-domestic retrofit policy fairly soon. It's published nearly 2 years ago now. Covers the retrofit of all non-domestic buildings, whether they be normal buildings, as it were, or heritage buildings, whether they're large or small, and whatever sector they're in. And if we look at the non-domestic building sector, it's quite a scary sector. This is a map, if you like, or this diagram is a map of the non-domestic building stock in England and Wales produced by my colleagues at University College London. They have a non-domestic building stock database for the UK. The little white square top right shows is equivalent to 1 square kilometre of floor space. So you can get an idea of the scale of the stock. The main reason for showing you this is that if you look at this line, I think you can probably see my pointer running down there, then essentially to the left of it, 65% of the stock falls into 3 categories: offices, shops, and industrial buildings. And the other 35% is everything else. So there's quite an imbalance in the way the stock is divided by types of buildings. This is another diagram to try and illustrate the characteristics of the non-domestic building stock, which I stole from Bayes, actually. What it shows is in 4 age bands, less than 50 square meters, very small buildings, 51 to 250, 251 to 1,000, and then very big buildings above 1,000 square meters. It shows a breakdown of, in the orange bars, the number of buildings in that band as a percentage of the total. In the yellow bars, the floor area of buildings in that band as a percentage of the total. And in the green bars, the energy use by buildings in that band as a percentage of the total. And so if we look at the left-hand 3 bars, band or blocks first, you can see that we've got 93% of all the buildings in the non-domestic sector in those 3 bands, and they're all less than 1,000 square meters, but they account for 43% of the total floor area and about 40% of energy use. So they can't be dismissed, but some of them are very small. If we now look at the block on the right, we see that 7% of all buildings in the sector account for 57% of the floor area in the yellow band and 60% of energy use in the green band. So in terms of policy and quick wins, you would go for the circle on the right. But in terms of delivering decarbonisation across the stock, we also have to look at this long tail of smaller buildings that follows behind, which are still responsible for a significant amount of energy use. So that will be one of the driving factors behind the policy which will be built on past 2038. Still with non-domestic buildings, to kind of summarise, in England and Wales there are 2 million premises. I say premises because sometimes buildings and premises don't map onto each other on a one-to-one basis. You get buildings with multiple premises and you get premises spread across multiple buildings. But that covers everything from the corner shops to the shard. It includes those 3 bulk classes I mentioned earlier: offices, shops, and industrial buildings. And relatively few of those very large buildings use most of the energy. Some are also what we call base buildings, mostly office blocks or shopping centres where there are multiple tenants in their own premises within the building. And then we do have many stocks of buildings which have multiple scattered premises in them or tenancies. They are like stocks for a retail chain, for example, which may have premises in many other base buildings. And of course, anybody who's been driving up and down the M1 recently will know that there are many big sheds in the industrial sector, some of them chill, but most of them just big sheds. And that is the part of the stock that's growing fastest. And if we look at retrofit in the non-domestic sector, much more than in the domestic sector, it's most often combined with commercial refurbishment or refitting, often driven by the need to re-let the building in the marketplace. We have these base buildings that I mentioned, and they're often retrofitted separately from the tenant spaces within the same building. So the landlord will look after the common parts and so on, and possibly the services or the shared services, and the tenants will look after their own spaces to their own schedule and their own specifications. But we do have in non-domestic retrofit much more professional involvement than in the domestic sector. In the domestic sector, retrofit was essentially deprofessionalized at the time of the Green Deal and Eco around 2010 by the removal of all the building professions from the schemes. We've been putting them back with past 2035, but that never happened in the non-domestic sector. We've always had professionals involved, of course. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time on variants of this diagram. This is the flow chart from past 2038. You'll find it in the front of the book. And It's divided into 5 columns. On the left, some special requirements for very small non-domestic buildings, which are quite like houses. They're domestic construction, domestic scale, domestic sort of services, not too big. Then we have a column that's of particular interest to this committee, which is the traditional and protected buildings, and we have some special requirements for those, which I'll come back to. The middle column down there with the heavy red boxes is the main spine of the flowchart, which shows the flow of the process which PAS 2038 imposes in order to ensure or support safe retrofit of safe and effective retrofit of buildings. Then we have some, in the fourth column, some requirements for buildings that are over 1,000 square meters, so the big ones on the right of my previous diagram. And the final column is some options that can be used. And those options have been introduced because of the complexity and the lack of homogeneity in the stock. There's a lot of variety, so we have to have lots of options for the way we treat it. So the first point to make about PAS 2038 is there's no retrofit coordinator, as there is in PAS 2035 for domestic buildings. In PAS 2038, we assume or require that there is at least one building professional attached to every project. Sometimes with very small buildings, there will be only one. But of that team, hopefully there's a team, one must be appointed for every project as the retrofit lead professional, and that person will fulfill effectively a role equivalent to that of retrofit coordinator. But that might be an architect, a surveyor, a specialist in building services, or any of those kind of professionals, because retrofit in the non-domestic sector takes very many different emphases. Then if we look at the main spine of the flowchart, you'll see that it's very similar to the PAS 2035 process. We have an assessment of the building, and an improvement option evaluation to identify what the building needs by 2050 in order to get towards net zero carbon. An agreement of intended outcomes for the project, which leads to a medium-term improvement plan, identifying the stages by which we get from where we are now to where we want the building to be in 20 or 30 years. A design and specification process, statutory approvals, and then work on site, which is followed by testing, commissioning, handover, and an evaluation. So what this doesn't have is the risk paths that PAS 2035 has, A, B, and C. All of the buildings in the non-domestic sector follow one path through PAS 2038. Starting up top left then, buildings which are not more than 500 square meters are made of traditional construction, 1 or 2 stories, and have simple building services, heating, hot water, lighting, ventilation, are allowed to comply with PAS 2035 instead of PAS 2038. And this is really to cope with converted homes that are in the non-domestic sector, things like corner shops, sometimes salons, sometimes dental surgeries, and so on, where PAS 2035 would be more appropriate. Then in the traditional and protected buildings column, we have additional requirements. The first one is that the professionals working on those kinds of buildings are required to have additional qualifications, the same as they are in PAS 2035, so that they have to have some conservation or heritage background in the way in their experience and qualification. And then we require BS 7913 significant assessments of any buildings that are traditionally constructed or protected. And if significance is found, there is then a requirement for a heritage impact assessment of the building, and that will then have an effect on much of the rest of the process of deciding what to do to the building in terms of retrofit. Then going over to the right, we have quite a few options for the way in which we decide how much energy is currently used by the building. We can use the deck, or we can model the building with SBEM or PHPP or a dynamic simulation model such as is designed by TM54. That range of options is chosen to allow lots of flexibility to apply the right model to each type of building in a very varied stock. The same applies to the improvement option evaluation. We can use SBEM, PHPP, or a dynamic simulation model to simulate the performance of the building and to look at the improvement options and their cost effectiveness. It's also a requirement that at the time of the improvement option evaluation, any building over 1,000 square meters must also have calculation of whole life greenhouse gas emissions for the building in its improved state. So we have to consider the whole life emissions as part of the option evaluation. There's an option to adopt the CIBSE RIBA soft landing scheme, which is a quality assurance scheme, again for buildings over 1,000 square meters. And if we do that, it affects quite a lot of the subsequent work in the process. And then down at the bottom, a unique feature of PAS 2038 is that you don't really know, in many cases, when you do retrofit, who's going to be in the building or what they're going to be doing. Very often it's between tenancies during retrofit, or between occupants for some other reason. And so when the occupants arrive and start running their business or whatever it is in there, then you discover what they're doing. So it's very important that we allowed a fine-tuning process. So some weeks or perhaps a few months after handover, there's a requirement for buildings over 1,000 square meters to be subject to fine-tuning of the building services controls in particular, to make sure that they're well matched to the activities that are being accommodated in the building. And then finally, we have an evaluation process. The purpose of the evaluation is to confirm that the agreed outcomes further up the process have been achieved and that there haven't been any unintended consequences. And this process feeds back through remedials until there is a satisfactory outcome to the project. So that's PAS 2038. To summarize, we're covering all non-domestic buildings. There are multiple options to deal with the scale and complexity of the stock. Excuse me. The process is similar to PAS 2035, but there are no risk paths. So we go through assessment, improvement option evaluation, a medium-term improvement plan, design and specification, installation, commissioning, testing, handover, and then fine-tuning and evaluation. And we have quite a lot of options for larger buildings, including using the design performance methodology, soft landings, and the fine-tuning. So that's all I wanted to say, really, to introduce the standard. I'm going to hand you back to Dan now and look forward to hearing from Hannah, who is actually the only person I know who has been trying to use PAS 2038. So I'm looking forward to hearing how it's been going for her. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter. It was really interesting to hear from someone that was so heavily involved in writing PAS 2038. And our next speaker may be familiar to some of our regular audience, as Hannah Wooler is returning for a second time to speak at our events. And Hannah is founder and creative director at Matter of Place Architects. She is AABC qualified and has a special interest in heritage-based placemaking. Matter of Place Architects, a community interest company, has been designed to deliver best practice in this field. And as an avid designer and conservation architect, Hannah is passionate about the long-term holistic sustainability of the built environment. And I'll hand over to Hannah now when you're ready.
Thank you. Right, let's just share my screen. Right, can everybody see that?
Yeah, it's good, Hannah. Thank you.
Fantastic. Right, I've been asked to elaborate because last time with only three speakers, we were restricted to 10 minutes, and the entire concept of PAS 238 and an exemplar in 10 minutes was quite tricky. So I'm hoping that there's not too much overlap. So if you did see it last time, there's enough new here for it to be interesting, but do feel free to ask more probing questions if necessary. Now, last time I caveated that I am no expert, seeing as this is the sort of first go we've had at using PAS 2038. I'm now here with Peter, so we'll understand at the end whether I've applied everything correctly. So let's fingers crossed. So this is me. This is the introduction. Thank you very much for that, Dan. The Mopper is now 6 months old, and I seem to have found a niche helping people with very tricky buildings. That's a great it's a great place for me to be as an architect, and decarbonisation of some of these buildings are particular examples of where that trickiness lies. This is a slide from the last presentation, which just explains how PAS 2038, or how we should think of buildings when we're looking at retrofit. So this is a view along, it's a classic view in Norwich, looking across our riverside. But the point here is that there's more similarity between the cathedral and the traditional constructed buildings on the top arrow than there are from the modern buildings indicated in the under arrow. So there's a very clear definition used within PAS 2038 of traditional buildings and modern construction, and that's anything constructed before 1919. Now, Peter, you may recognise these diagrams. This is my summary, which covers the element that was in Peter's talk before about the development and history of the PAS framework, and starting out through the BSI Retrofit Standards group, coming out of the Each Home Counts review. I won't go over it because Peter has explained it all in more knowledgeable detail than I. And here we have, looking at those 2 million non-domestic premises, of which about 30% in general fall into the traditional pre-1919 construction, and overall this sector is responsible for 17% of the energy consumption in the UK. So retrofit here. Oh, and I think this is one of Peter's facts actually, 70% of these buildings are likely to still be in use by 2050, which makes retrofit of our non-domestic sector a real interesting conundrum. So this is the project that we were looking at. So this is Winsome Lodge. It's in South Norwich, it's in the city centre. It's a complex of 5 buildings. It was interesting what Peter was saying about the premises, because this is very much a single premises split between 5 buildings. The building here in the photo is Music House, is by far the most significant of the 5. However, they very much function as a cluster, both in terms of their programme, which is as an adult education centre for Norfolk County Council, but also as a facility. So you'll see in the photos that they're very much linked together through a common urban realm. This is the site plan. I'll repeat this slide later when you can get so you can understand. There is a little flicking around of orientation to get these on the map, to fit these on the screen, but the Maltings building on the right is to the north of the site. The river is on the east, and the road, which is King Street, is on the west. So there are 5 buildings. Music House, which is grade 1 listed, and it's probably under recognised in its significance. It's one of the oldest houses of its size still standing in a legible form in the UK. It just isn't celebrated or actually open to the public other than very rarely, so not as much known about it as should be. The other buildings, the Tuns, the Stables, the Maltings and the Craft Block, are remnants of a very large brewing history in this part of Norwich. They're deemed to be about 1850 in date, although you'll see later there isn't an exact date for them. I'm sorry, that is my phone and it's out of reach, so we're just going to have to let it ring out, I'm afraid. So we were brought onto this project to look at the retrofit and reimagining of the site as a centre of crafting excellence. So we had already been working at Winsome Lodge since, I think I started in 2018. So we'd done 2 iterations of trying to make a viable solution to, it's already a centre of craft, but it was to densify the use and make it accessible and bring it up to current standards. One of the issues is the historic servicing of the site. So we were tasked with decarbonising or understanding a route to net zero for the site back at the end of 2021. And we received a brief from the client, which was a decarbonisation brief. And then as we started on the work, the client became aware of PAS 2038, and in parallel with us starting the work, wrote a PAS 2038 brief on that route. So we were all learning in parallel. So I went on a course to the PAS 2035 course in parallel with the development of the brief. So when we received the PAS 2038 brief, we were up to speed and could begin to apply the work that we'd already been looking against the different stages. And our brief was from stages 1 to 7, so to get to the agreement of intended outcomes for the site. So this is just a little bit more about the site so you can understand our work there. So you can see here are the 5 buildings. So Music House is the one with the arrow. The Maltings is a malting house. It's very long. It's one of only 2 still standing within the city centre in Norwich. There were a lot. It was a big brewing centre. The one to the left of Music House is a cooperage called the Tons. In the middle is the stable block. And then this pink, long, low L shape in the foreground, we call the craft block, but that was part of the production and storage element of the brewery, and it's a remnant of a much larger shed that ran all the way along the riverfront there. It's the river in the foreground here. So Music House in the background is an L-shaped stone and brick house. This is it. So King Street running along the bottom here. These are the crypt plans. Now there's evidence that these crypts were of early 14th century and are underbuilt below a building form. With the house, there's evidence of the house on the site in 1175, so it's an incredibly old property. Oh, sorry. And here's some photos of some of the significant areas. So the roof is possibly original, but possibly within the first few waves of iterations of development on the site. It's a scissor roof. They used to believe it had been brought in from the continent, but actually now think that it's quite possible it was built specifically for this site. It's amazing that it's in such an extant condition. That's just in one of the classrooms. And then underneath we've got the crypt. We can just see in the photo in the centre here, and 2 photos of the Music House from the outside. And on the right hand side there's a column base, and in the 1940s it was established that the column was identical to one of those within the Cathedral Infirmary. So here's an image of the sectional plan from the Cathedral Infirmary, which has now been lost, but it's likely that the stonework was unloaded on the wharf next to Winsome Lodge, and possibly one of the columns fell off the back of a barge and has ended up in the base of this building. But here are some photos of the current condition, so you can see why this why it's such a challenge for Norfolk and they need to get this retrofit. The building is actually in the ownership of Norwich City Council and leased by Norfolk, but you can see the poor quality servicing that we've got, generation on generation of decoration and decision making, not at all in keeping with the sensitivity of the building. So because we knew the building well, we managed to get up and running quite quickly. There are 5 of those 5 buildings. They are all traditional, so they're all pre-1919, and they're all noted in the conservation area. So the Music House, the one I've just shown you, is grade 1 listed, but the rest of them are deemed to be traditional under PAS 2038 and have their own protections through the local listings here in Norwich. So here we get, so we arrive at stage 5. I'll just flick back quickly to the table. Here we go. So we arrived at stage 5, which is the assessment of the site. And under stage 5, we have to consider the context, the existing fabric condition, the occupancy, and the energy performance. Now, one of the main challenges they have, Norfolk County Council have with Winsome Lodge, is there's no sub-metering within the site. So we could do a lot of work around the context, and in fact had done so. A statement of significance had been commissioned through the previous works, and we had done a high-level condition survey, and I identified a lot of defect work which was required to deal with damp and other existing fabric failures within the building. So we already had quite a lot of information on context and existing fabric condition. The occupancy is very low, but that was gathered through the council. The energy performance was very well recorded in the form that it was, which was site-wide, but we had very little evidence on a building by building basis. So here we are, let's just have a look at these buildings. So these are the brewery buildings here that I was talking about. So you can see these are the photos of the edge of the Tons, which is the Cooperage building. So you can see there's a fantastic aesthetic, a palimpsest of repair and work over the years. So there isn't much capacity for change in the fabric upgrade within the external appearance of these buildings. They're very sensitive and very visible. There isn't a back or a front on these buildings. Every elevation is visible and significant, making a significant contribution to the site. But there is a lot of potential for fabric improvements within the buildings. I don't know if you can see here, but these are plastic rainwater goods. The roofs are uninsulated. I'm just going to flick forward so you can have a look at some of the photos inside so you can see what we're looking at. So here we've got dropped ceilings inside with little insulation, little or no insulation. We've got all of these doors along here leak, so you've got water ingress. In the bottom left, this is look inside the Tons building. Here we've got, there's no LED lighting within any of these spaces, or very little LED lighting within the spaces. Here we've got no insulation in the roof void and an asbestos lining beneath the tiles. This is a sprung dance floor, which was brought from somewhere else into the space, but luckily this building's not listed, so that dance floor can in fact be moved. We've then got brick vaults which have been painted with a non-sympathetic, non-breathable paint, so we've got spalling and salts building up behind the paintwork. And then on the right, this is one of the most sensitive parts of the Maltings buildings. These are the existing kiln, the remnants of the kilns, where we've got some really bad dropped ceilings, very ancient lighting within the space. Where am I? Sorry, damp. Oh yes, so we did do some in situ U-value measurements on the site as part of the assessment. Not as many as we would have liked because it was coming to be summer, so we only got a chance to do one round. So that was 3 measurements in 2 areas of the building. So we couldn't use it. It's not they were compliant tests, but we didn't feel it was enough of a survey to actually give you a thorough reading or any assumptions across the site. So we caveated it very heavily that further U-value tests would need to be done, and they have now been done subsequent to our work at the site. But it was really interesting in the 2 areas where we measured the solid walls, which were in the craft block and in the stables in the middle, in the hub building. We managed the building fabric formed nearly 30% better than the assumed U values, which was really interesting. In terms of damp and understanding the moisture within the building, there were so many defects that were obviously causing the damp. We didn't take in situ damp measurements, but one of the things that would be really interesting to talk about and actually to hear from Peter about is a challenge that we had, which was what counts as a defect when you're looking at complete retrofit, because there are so many areas of this building where there were cold bridges at the eaves, there were cold bridges around the door frames, there were air leakage gaps, but all of these would be addressed as part of the works. So it didn't seem appropriate to spend a lot of time calculating their impact when we had worked out details which would negate their influence once the retrofit had been applied. So that was an interesting challenge, and because we had already done a lot of work on the building, understanding what the client's appetite for change was within the scope of the decarbonisation works, because in fact we could have been quite wide-reaching. Some of the classrooms were undersized and some were oversized. We would have had to have done some work to the partitions within to deal with a thermal upgrade, because we were looking at internal insulation, and so we would have needed to adapt the end of these. They were just timber stud partitions, so in which case should we look at realigning them to form the new classrooms? So there was an interesting debate with the client all the way through as to how much work fell within the scope of the retrofit. So it was very interesting looking at the significance. Luckily for me, a statement of significance had been carried out, because although I am qualified to do the assessment on a building as complex and layered as these, I'm an architect and not a heritage consultant, and so I would be loath to apply my to exceed my capability, but luckily we had a statement of significance prepared, so I could look at the impact of the moves we were proposing against the various elements of significance. So one of the really interesting things on the site here is its ability to look at different servicing strategies. So there was a long list considered of all of the servicing. Currently the buildings are serviced, I'll just flick down. So currently the buildings are serviced from a single boiler position inside the north end of the site, underneath the 3-storey element of the Maltings building. And that is used to distribute wet heating systems through the music house and the Maltings, with the stables, the craft block and the tons having direct gas fires within the space, gas heaters. This is a problem already. Even without the decarbonisation, it's a problem. But any move away is going to increase the electricity power loading on the site, and there isn't sufficient power. So any solution on this site involves the construction of a substation alongside the tons here. Some early stage engagement has been undertaken, so the substation has been sized and a site and access identified on the site. So the overall proposal in the end was for the tons building to have to be serviced as a standalone using air source heat pumps from a local location, the craft, the stables and somewhat of the Maltings to be serviced from a river source heat pump, with pipes laid in the base of the Winsome coming into a centralised plant location in the basement of the craft block in this location over here to the south. And then the music house and the remainder of the Maltings to have direct electric heating, because the fabric of music house is sufficiently significant that we cannot take new service runs back through to allow for the areas required for a low surface temperature system. So the servicing, and then on the site, the swapping for LED lights obviously within the building is a no-brainer. We've got a schedule of fabric upgrade, and then there's 3 locations for photovoltaics, here on the south face of the Maltings, here on the south pitch of the stables, and here on the south face of the craft block. Due to the sensitive nature of the site, you may or may not get permission for photovoltaics on those locations, but even so they only produce up to about 40% of the electricity required for the decarbonised site. So looking at going back to my work, so when we had developed a series of fabric upgrades, these were then assessed against the heritage significance as required under the PAS guidance. So we produced it's a really neat little document, I'm really happy with it, where you look at the overall significance of the site, the various elements of significance, and then assess the pieces of work against those areas of significance. So here we have an example, that's the overall heritage significance, and here are the pieces of work. And the first piece was the Maltings roof. So one of the proposals we had was the redesign of the roof, because the dormers are 20th century edition, very poorly constructed with little to no insulation and very leaky. So what we were saying was a better solution would be to reinstate the original full pitch of the roof with proper insulation, proper breathable insulation in the build up, and then that allows us the space for the photovoltaics on the south facing pitch. And so we looked at the significance of what it affected, assessed the beneficial impact, the harmful impact, and came up with a proposed solution. And so that sort of brings us to where we got to at the end of Winsome Lodge. So we did produce a full report. It was the lead professional in that job was was the building services engineer from Hawley, so we were feeding into their report, but it was very much an iterative approach, working with the client who never received a report like that, with us developing it. It took about 6 months, I think, backwards and forwards to actually get the report into a usable format for them to then be able to take the outcomes and design a programme of works. But I now know, having worked with a couple of other local authorities, that this is being rolled out on a much larger basis. So this is a very interesting future project that I know coming. I can't give you much details because I've asked, and it's confidential at this time. But there's another local authority with a very large, well, a large estate, who are looking at using PAS 2038 to commission the decarbonisation of their whole building stock. And the way that they're doing it is they've spent the last 5 years developing a really detailed as-is position on each of their buildings. And at the moment, they've got energy and building professionals out assessing the capacity for change within each of their buildings. So that's running through the PAS clauses 1 to 8. And at the end of that, they will have developed enough of a brief that they will go out to the market to procure the complete decarbonisation of their estate using the PAS 2038 clause 8 reports as the brief. And I think that there's a couple of them coming out to the market at the moment. So it'll be really interesting to see how the tier 1 contractors start adapting to this as a workflow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. It was really good to hear about your experience with PAS 2038 in more detail. And I must admit, I really like the Winsome Lodge project, mainly because you've got a whole range of buildings all on one site, maybe with slightly different needs and slightly different solutions as well. So it's a really good example of a project. We'll give people a moment to ask some questions. We'll move on to looking at those questions. I just start us off, Hannah. I just wondered if you found any challenges in finding suitably experienced building services engineers to work with on either the PAS 2038 project or heritage projects in general.
Yes, it is a challenge. If you are a good building services engineer and you fancy moving to East Anglia, we would love to have you. I know that there is more and more people working more nationally and working wider, but East Anglia is a real challenge. I think that it's specifically working at this sort of the edge of this new wave of understanding of how to treat buildings. We're all engaging in it and upskilling, and then services engineer engaging, upskilling. And I think that the role for services engineers in controlling and making sensible decisions around carbon investment for carbon saving is you are going to play such a key role that the more upskilled and the more of you, the better. But yes, it is a challenge at the moment.
Thank you, Hannah. And a question for Pete, and then we'll come on to one from Hannah Cates in the chat. Was there anything that you weren't able to include in PAS 2038, which may be developed for inclusion in a future version of this specification?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I can't think of anything at the moment that we didn't get in. We had a really strong steering group from across the industry, including lots of representatives of the heritage part of the industry and representatives of CIBSE. So I think it was pretty good, really. They made sure that we touched the right bases, if you see what I mean. I think the reality is that experiences such as Hannah has had applying the process, it's supposed to provide a robust process that people can follow in order to not fall into trouble with technical risks, essentially, and to get to zero carbon eventually. And I think those kind of experiences from Hannah and from others, I hope, will enable us to say in a year or so's time, okay, this is what we've learned, this is what works, this is what doesn't, and we'll perhaps make some amendments at that point. There was a suggestion from BEIS about a month ago that they'd like to review PAS 2038, and the Retrofit Standards Task Group said, well, why do you want to do that? Hardly anybody's used it yet. But I think that's because what they're trying to do is shake their policies out, and they want the standard to be consistent with the policies. My view is that the standards should drive the policies and not the other way around. it's coming. This is a thing that's come from industry, so the government policy should be respecting the way that industry wants to go about doing things. So we'll see over the next year or two, I guess.
Thank you, Pete. I mean, from an engineer's perspective, I'm a building services engineer. I was very impressed to see when I read through past 2038 how much consideration is given to the moisture performance of buildings with retrofit options. So that was for me was a particular strength of the framework. So we're going to move on to a question from Hannah Cates, which is a question for Hannah Wooler, so Hannah to Hannah. She's asked, can you talk a little bit more about her specific role in the Norwich project, where it is clear that there were a lot of consultants on board?
Yeah, it is a little bit confused, especially because I've tried to summarise 4 years worth of work into one talk, because there were different teams involved. So in the when we were looking at the sort of program of the site, so a more traditional stage 1 feasibility, we were a full design team. So we had cost consultants, structure engineers, services consultants, and ourselves, and a heritage consultant, all working at looking at the various elements of the site. So we did 2 iterations of that. So when it came to doing the decarbonisation work, there were actually only 4 of us involved. So 2 from Hawley and 2 from the building side, because we were bringing together such a comprehensive package of work. We didn't need more structural input at that time, because we'd already had the structural condition survey and developed some of the key details. And because I had always looked at the building with a conservation eye, the proposals we were making in terms of fabric upgrade didn't have to be completely there were revisions when we needed to get more performance out of certain buildings, and there were details which needed looking at, but it wasn't a complete go again. So actually we were a relatively small team when we were looking at the decarbonisation. So there was me and an assistant who worked with me looking at the building fabric, and we did probably about half of the report, I think, because this one was led by the building services. So they front-ended it and did a lot of the rationalisation, and then we did all of the building fabric work.
Thank you, Hannah. Maybe staying with you for a moment, we've got a couple of it's a few questions in one post from Bill Bordas, so maybe we'll do it step by step. So his first question is, do you think the Maltings project will proceed? And he's wondering if that will be a big project or phased. If you...
Yeah, so in Norfolk County Council, I think. So we when we first did the project, it was to be one big project, and then the second iteration was to do it phased. That was really depressing, and I really hope that if they retake it on, that we do not go back to the phased position, because the problem with the phased position, and this is a big problem with large capital expenditure on local authority buildings, is they weren't willing to outlay on the first phase for the building services to support the whole site. So you were looking at building by building, which meant we couldn't do the water source heat pump, because it only works out as a viable option if it supports more than 2 of the buildings on the site. And so you suddenly lost the water source, which was a really interesting part of it. And we were looking at hiding heat pumps and building enclosures, and there was big heritage significant issues, and none of the elegant offer, which was how you can successfully retrofit a really complex heritage site. So the phasing was rubbish. So fingers crossed, if it does come back, it doesn't come back like that. However, local authorities at the moment aren't investing in big capital projects. So I think Winsome Lodge is a really tricky conundrum for the city. Something will have to happen there. It's a really significant site and is under threat. So something will happen, but it's not going to happen this year.
Yeah, I suppose you have to sort of think about both sides, don't you? And think about financial pressures and budgets and what clients are able to do, as well as what the ideal approach is for a project. The second part of Bill's question is actually quite specific, so it might be something you can advise or not. But he's asked, what do you think the extra overcost is for the energy carbon retrofit in relation to what might have been done to refurbish the building without past 2038 and the zero carbon policy?
In this instance, very little, because we had applied quite a lot of the thinking already, because the water source heat pump was part of the original thinking on the site. I didn't talk about it in this presentation because I talked about it last time, but this element of the river in Norwich has been pre-approved by the Environment Agency for use for heat pumps, because you'll know much more about this than me, but it slightly changes the temperature of the water, and it's a hot spot in Norwich city centre. So there's actually one water source heat pump already being installed about 200 yards down the river. No, maybe a bit further than that, maybe half a mile down the river. And so was how you could service the site from the river. And the fabric, I think there's a bit of an upgrade in trying to get to net zero, because that wasn't the objective in the first. The objective before was a sustainable retrofit, and then so there's the difference between a sustainable retrofit and net zero. But because we wanted the water source heat pump, we needed the substation, and all of the buildings need some work. The uplift in this instance was not PAS 2038. The uplift in this instance is Music House, and what on earth you do with it, because it's such a sensitive building. You cannot do it in half measures. It needs a proper conservation plan, proper conservation architects, proper contractors. It's a serious project to take that building from where it is to where it needs to be.
Yeah, I'm really interested in what you're saying about water source heat pumps. See the vicinity of the river. I've been lucky enough to see both an open loop water source heat pump in a heritage building and a closed loop water source heat pump in a heritage building just this week. But I suppose my question, if you do know this, is do you know if you were looking at an open loop water source heat pump where you're abstracting from the river and discharging back into it, or
it was a closed loop, but I can't for the life of me remember why.
There's so many reasons. There's so many good reasons to do it closed loop, but also on occasion when you can do open loop, it's great too. Okay, moving on then. We've got a question from, hope to say your name correctly, it's Bajwa Sishan, and they have asked, how much does PAS 2038 energy guidance differ from the new Part L2B guidance? So I'm not sure who wants to take that one.
Oh, I can have a go. I mean, the simple answer is that the building regulations provides minimum technical standards when you do work to existing buildings. And it is exactly that. It's technical standards, and they are the minimum. PAS 2038 tries to do something different, which is to provide a best practice process for robust and safe retrofit of the building to any particular standard that you wish to adopt, because the PASs don't specify technical standards in terms of performance. They just say, whatever you're going to try to achieve, this is a way of doing it without getting into trouble. So they're different things, and they sit alongside each other to a degree. I would expect that many people working to zero carbon or to decarbonisation would have to do better than the minimum standards in Part L2B anyway. So this question becomes academic at that point if the aspiration is to decarbonise.
Thank you, Peter. And I've got a question from, it says Nito Bradley, Andre Paul, and this one is for Hannah. It says very cool example, so you got support to that. Did you factor in impact of likely future climate conditions on retrofit choices and decisions? And if so, how and with what data and evidence?
Yes, we did. It's overheating and heat events that are considered in this. In this instance, that was less relevant because we were not looking at cooling of the buildings, because we're looking at natural ventilation through the buildings. They will have a lot of openings, and there was a lot of potential for purge cooling, and they're quite underpopulated because you're looking at craft endeavours. So in areas where there is high level activity, like if there's a forge or silversmithing, then there's extract, which deals with the heat as part of that process. And when you're looking at few people in a classroom, there's a transfer, and it was about change management processes. However, there is a huge issue on the site with surface water runoff, because it's at the bottom of the hill, forming a brick block between hill and the river, which is where the water's all trying to go. So we did a lot of work in the physical ducting across the site, so taking surface water and taking it to storage and pumping it back up to the road. Luckily, even though it's quite a steep slope across the site, the main services in the river, in the road, are very deep, so it wasn't a huge pumping situation, but a lot of it was about water management and potential flooding. Interestingly, only a small amount of the site is at risk of flooding from the river, and most of it is at risk from surface water, and a lot of that we looked at a programming of the spaces. So we looked at not using the basement spaces, so not attempting to program the basement spaces in areas where they were at high risk, and doing a zoning of the building so that when we looked at new services, we were taking the actual service runs and routes out of the flood routes for the water. Really interestingly, because it's such an old site, quite a lot of the drainage on the site goes straight into the river, which is one of the reasons why something has to be done about this site, because it's a terrible mess.
Thank you. I'll try and get another question in or two before we finish. So we've got a question from Fadia, who asks, Fadia is an architect and they want to know how to become an expert in this field, retrofit, conservation or heritage, or as Hannah Wooler calls it, a doctor for buildings. So maybe mention the course you went on. That might be interesting.
That's right, yeah. So I'm definitely not an expert. As I said before, everybody's learning in this, so it's really it's a fantastic thing to learn about. There's such a lot of academics and good research work out there, and it's about finding routes to learn about it. So I worked for Purcell, so I did a lot of my heritage training through them and supported through their really good mentoring and training processes, that's how I got my AABC qualification. And then subsequently I put myself through many courses, most recently the NOCN level 3 retrofit of traditional buildings course, which is I really recommend. I think Peter has suggested some others when I was speaking to him the other day. So it's just about seeking out the best CPD that you can, and then talking about it, because if you talk about it, people give you an opportunity to apply it, which is really good. So I learned about PAS 2038 from a really good client that I work with, and she'd been on a course that had taught her about PAS 238, and she was looking to apply it. So I upskilled so I could work with her to develop this brief. So it's a sort of, yeah, it's do the courses and talk about doing the courses is the answer, I think.
Thank you, Hannah. That's really helpful to have that insight. So I'm going to wrap up now just so that we can finish in time. The Retrofitting Heritage Committee is planning more knowledge shares and another open forum event in the coming months. So there are two ways which you can keep up to date with our activities. I'll put a link to our website in the chat now for anyone that is interested. So that should have gone through. And the other way to keep up to date is to join our LinkedIn group page, which I will also put into the chat. See how we get on. Excellent. So I think all that remains is to say thank you everyone for joining us today, and a massive thank you to both Peter and Hannah. I hope you have enjoyed and learned as much from them as I have. So when you're ready, if you could dial out from this meeting, and thank you to everyone again.
Thank you everyone.
Bye.
Bye.